Welcome to yet another Zoom Out video with Ambassador Michael Salin and myself, Lars-Erik, covering essential security policy issues for Sweden, for Europe and the world. This is only one out of many podcasts that you will find on our SoundCloud channel, on Spotify and other media, sometimes also on YouTube. We have published these podcasts over several years as a basis for the production of a number of books on Swedish and European security, on the North-South dimension of European security, etc. In focus today, we have the issue of NATO enlargement, Sweden and Finland, and what Turkey has to do with this. We are discussing the issue whether this is an issue related to the bilateral relations between Turkey and the Nordic countries, or whether it's in reality a much wider issue of Turkey's place in NATO, what Turkey wants from NATO and from the EU, and in general, the situation facing Turkey as a major country in the southeastern part of Europe, close to the Middle East, close to Caucasus and Russia, close to the Western Balkans, etc. So again, the comparative advantage of us, perhaps in this context, is that we have used to try to zoom out consistently on these various security policy issues as we have gone along, since everything has a bigger context, and that you may lose perspective if you zoom in too much on individual issues. We are also now facing questions not only in Sweden, but also, for instance, from the US, what all of this means. Is it merely an issue of Kurds, terrorism, or is it a wider set of problems? Michael Salin, as we say in Swedish, Mikael Salin. You and I, we are now into our third year of podcasts, sometimes for a very small crowd in Sweden, close to the military political establishment, security establishment in Sweden, discussing within the context of our Royal Academy of War Sciences in Sweden, where you have had an active role, also I. We have done several books together on the southern dimension of European security, on the strategic balancing act that Sweden faces in its security policy, and now recently in a more comprehensive report on security policy on behalf of the Academy. So, of course, we are constantly coming back to the issue of Turkey in the context of Ukraine, and now most recently in the context of Sweden's interest in joining NATO ahead of the Madrid summit coming up very soon. And it's no secret, perhaps, to tell those who might be listening to this that you, in particular, have received many questions about this, and you have appeared constantly on television and in different radio discussions on how to understand the situation. And most recently, you also received a question from an international prominent magazine on how one can explain to American and other audiences what Sweden could ever, what could be the importance of Sweden in this wider context. So obviously, I put the question initially, what should be the purpose of this podcast? And for me, myself, I think we have already agreed, you and I, that we should zoom out. We should do the things that we do best, namely our comparative advantages overview on the overall Swedish security landscape, and European security and how it fits in with the southern dimension. And we should at the same time look at time perspectives, zoom out on those, and we should zoom out on the Turkish position in this context. So those would be three dimensions of this podcast, perhaps, that we could agree on. Mm. And let me start by just quoting this now sometimes famous and sometimes infamous European security strategy from 2003, which talks about a Europe which has never been as secure, prosperous, and free as it was in 2003 in a period of convergence. To 1999, we had the Istanbul summit of the OSCE agreeing on important principles for European security in the last year, more or less, of Yeltsin's presidency. So these three dimensions are actually quite useful, not only to discuss the situation of Sweden and Europe in a critical time, but when we talk about security, when we talk about prosperity, and when we talk about freedom, there are important things to know about Turkey. Maybe you would like to start there.
Yes, when I do that, I think back on having followed Turkish affairs since 1995, so I feel like I'm a veteran in the context of those that have followed or tried to follow the ups and downs and the bumps on the road to nationhood in Turkey. So that is quite a fascinating theme. I think you're right in distinguishing between those three aspects, because they can be used not only for measuring security in Europe, but also one individual country like Turkey. And so, if I were to start in the area of freedom, I would say that the Turkey's biggest problem right now, but there are many, is lack of freedom. Lack of freedom on the part of too many citizens, and that in turn is a case and a result of years of progress in an authoritarian direction, meaning that when Turkey was admitted as a candidate for EU membership, I will leave the Nato aspects aside for the moment, but talking about the EU, that was back in 1999. And that in turn was a very tumultuously interesting period in the history of Turkey, because several things happened at that same year. The leader of the PKK, Öcalan, was arrested in Kenya and then deported to Turkey and put to trial, which led to or contributed to a clear weakening of the PKK's military activities at that time, more or less suing unilaterally for ceasefire, let's say, arrangements. And secondly, we had the earthquakes happening in Greece and in Turkey that summer, which were disastrous for both cases, but it also gave rise to sympathy and assistance as between those two countries, which from a NATO point of view, was a big relief that it led to a deepening of understanding and their neighborhood, which, because you had the background also of both countries of having had military rule over critical years of the post-war era. So it led to a sympathy between them and the Gem Papandreou process, so-called, which paved the way for the Finnish presidency of the EU to invite Turkey as a candidate for membership. And being a candidate means that you are seen to have sufficiently applied with or adapted to or implemented the Copenhagen criteria, which speak a lot about freedom values of sorts. And that in turn led to a change of government in Turkey itself after a huge economic crisis at the end of the millennium in those days. But the beginning then, after the AKP came to power in Turkey, a reformed Islamist, moderately Islamist party under the leadership of Erdogan. In fact, he came to power in sort of November that year, 2002, which has made some people talk about the possibility of elections being held that day, this fall, putting those elections earlier than otherwise anticipated for June next year. So you had this process happening, and then you had a big process of power struggle between the new forces of Turkey, led by AKP, a moderate Islamist party, which was seen to also be more reflective between politics and society, in view of the then prevailing fact that Turkey is overwhelmingly Islamic, Sunni Islamic. Used to be 60% in the 20s. By this time, it was 98% or so. Which meant that there was some coexistence between politics and society of sorts, which in turn allowed for openings of various kinds of freedoms, formally as a process of adaptation to the acquis communautaire of the European Union. So you had a period there, and then that sort of more fortunate period in terms of freedom of the people, freedom from poverty, freedom from oppression, freedom from imposed Kemalism, freedom from anti-Islamic symbols like the headscarf, things like this. So a transformative period, and then unfortunately this period has arrived at difficulties which maybe could not be foreseen at the time, but should have been foreseen, because there was an action-reaction process of negative sorts between the EU and Turkey, so that leaders of Europe, Sarkozy, Merkel, for example, were starting to raise questions as to whether Turkey was really suitable for full membership of the EU in terms of its size, in terms of its importance in Nato, which could be a good thing perhaps, but also in terms of being overwhelmingly Islamic and led by an Islamist, or at least Islamic, government at the time. So, and then of course there was the reactions in Turkey to that those new signs of hesitancy and in Europe, and then you have the process. So we can talk more about this, but more or less, as from the beginning of the second decade of the 2000s, you have had a sort of negative spiral of events and huge bumps on the road. And in today's Turkey, you have a government and you have a constitution imposed by the current government with a very, very narrow margin in 2017, 1 year after the attempted coup in 2016. And that constitution specifies rather unique competencies. There are many other countries in the world that are authoritarian, but very few have specified the degree of authoritarianism to the same extent as in the case of Turkey, although Turkey is a NATO member, although Turkey remains a candidate formally for EU membership. Still, you have a constitution which gives very little checks and balance to check the powers of the president and the power of the party and the power of the establishment over civil society, over the media, over the judiciary. It is such that both de facto and de jure we have a clearly authoritarian situation, and the issues now are to what extent and under what conditions those provisions of Turkey and those criteria of its governance can be changed for Turkey to return to more European, more democratic, more free conditions than has been the case, because for many years, because Turkey has appealed to the threat of terrorism as a constant raison d'etre, a constant basis of legitimacy and a constant basis to legitimize draconian measures against perceived enemies of the regime, domestically and abroad. And this, of course, has created many difficulties in the relationship between this very important country, 84 million people, for Christ's sake. So it's big, and it's located in a very sort of sensitive position, east, west, north, south. So lots is at stake, and the elections planned for next year, but that could happen before that, are so crucial for the future of Europe and for the stability of the transatlantic arena. And now, of course, we have the Ukraine crisis, which further enhances the sensitivity connected with Turkey.
Well, so one can say that in one way, what you just described is the movement from convergence. I remember very well, I was actually in Istanbul during this summit that I mentioned in 1999, exactly when the earthquake took place. With all the leaders were there. I mean, Clinton and Yeltsin and all there, and there was an outpour of sympathy towards Turkey at that time. And there was the mere fact that the summit took place in Turkey was also a signal that Turkey had a standing of legitimacy in terms of representing OSCE commitments and values, which was symbolic of the convergence period when we were still very hopeful about the future. So this dimension of freedom and including democracy, human rights, rule of law, has then had a very bumpy road, even an attempted coup d'etat, etc., which has led to a very strong hesitation on the European side whether this is an actor that is really possible to integrate into the European Union without fundamentally changing the balance of power inside the Union. Some people already criticize the enlargement period. But here, of course, one has to remember that Sweden, not least during the period when Carl Bildt was foreign minister, had very close consultations with Turkey on different issues and was clearly appreciative of the importance of Turkey as an international player. Because obviously Turkey is a key actor in many securities. If we move to the second, perhaps second dimension, the security dimension, Turkey is sort of everywhere. Almost always when you talk about an important issue relating to Europe, even the Middle East and a southern dimension of security, Turkey comes up. So it's very useful to sit and look at the map, actually. In all directions, you have Turkey there, including the Western Balkans, including Caucasus, etc., etc.
Talking about security in a broad sense, it's very useful to have a map because it summarizes history. The map shows all the minorities that have fled to Turkey from as a result of Russian aggression under the Tsarist period, for example, Circassians and others. There are so many that have fled to Turkey using it as a sanctuary, which create a mosaic of minorities inside Turkey. And on the other hand, the maps show the way Turkish presence and Turkish interests are reflective of the Ottoman Empire past. So you have Turkish interests very strongly, as you say, in the Balkans, and you have it in Libya, and you have it in Syria, and in Iraq, and in the Caucasus area. So you can see the way the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the interaction between those two and other empires have interacted over the years, and then creating the mosaic of today. And trying to somehow reconcile the trends of the past with the currencies and trends of the present looking forward, which is a fascinating exercise. And in all this, of course, Turkey, with 84 million people, being located where they are, combining history and geography, therefore, cannot avoid being a very, very important player. No matter how you look upon things, whether it is from the point of view of the current Ukraine crisis, or the current crisis in Libya, or wherever in this whole larger Middle East region, and you have contacts between Islamic Turkey and Islamic Taliban regime in Afghanistan, seen as a problem, but also as a potential for a solution by the West. So, to what camp does Turkey belong?
Yeah, and so you can have two different perspectives on this. One is that if Turkey is such an important player and such an important factor for our security at large, both from a NATO and EU perspective, it would be important to integrate Turkey in order to make sure that you have a possibility to have a constant cooperation and a way to increase dependence in order to thereby create the kind of basis for permanent peace that normally was expected after the Second World War. But the other alternative could be the one that Sarkozy and Merkel and others represented, namely that no, by integrating Turkey beyond its formal NATO membership, would be dangerous, because then we not only become a part of Turkey's problems, but we also become a part of the problems of the Middle East and other regions in a way that we don't want to be. We want to keep a distance from that, and not least in Germany, I suppose that was an important consideration in this context. And it's there I'm struck again by Davutoglu's, the former prime minister's, stated ambition that Turkey should be. What was the formula now? We should not have any enemies in its foreign relations. That was only about 5 or 6 years ago.
Zero problems with all neighbors.
Yes. So
his formula.
Yes. And what the Arab Spring meant in this context, so forth, was, of course, difficult to foresee when it started to move in 2010, 2011. So there we are not now, to be sure. We are in a situation where almost the opposite is true, that Turkey does have problems in many different relations. And as a member of NATO, Sweden will need to take an active part in the work to try to square the circle, not least considering the fact that there are Greece and Turkey, both are members of the NATO alliance. So is it better to stay outside there or be inside? Well, the question has been responded to both by the Swedish and Finnish governments. So, one word perhaps about prosperity as well. I mean, behind the whole problem of elections and security, we also have a very dramatic economic situation. We are in Sweden now facing an inflation of 7%, which is unprecedented for a very long time. We haven't had that kind of inflation. And we are through a very, very difficult situation in terms of the pandemic, almost through, but we are still going to have enormous costs in creating a more stable situation for the future in relation to possible crises of that nature. And then the Ukraine war, which is also going to be a heavy burden on the economies in Europe. But that's small, I suppose, in comparison to what you see in Turkey.
Yes. Lars-Erik, before we go into this, can I just follow up on one line from the security point of view, which is that Turkey, like other big countries with ambitious leaderships, needing to show ambition, foreign policy in order to strengthen you domestically. There are some similarities here between Erdogan in Turkey and then Putin in Russia, for example. But the problem is always that countries like this, with a history like this, tend to either feel humiliated and on the retreat from the ill-willing foreign powers, or feeling that they can and need to be sort of pushing forward. So there's a difficulty always of finding the stable balance between offensive and defensive, as those two concepts interplay with the foreign policy and domestic policies, especially in election years. In the case of Turkey, you mentioned Davutoglu, the former prime minister, currently one of the opposition party leaders, did coin the question deep strategic depth in an academic book in 2002, and then he became foreign minister and then prime minister, coinciding with the Arab Spring times. And then, of course, the translation of the or interpretation of the Arab Spring and the movements and the opening for adding Turkish influence into the Middle East region as a result of the openings created by the Arab Spring was so important to have Turkey becoming involved in the Syrian crisis and more generally in the whole Middle East, Libya later, etc. And similarly, in the case of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean, and the relationships with Greece and the Turkish feeling of being isolated from the cooperation between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece over oil exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean, combined with unsolved issues from the Lausanne Peace in 1923 over the islands and islets in the Aegean Sea. All those things tended to become a showdown situation between Turkey and its neighbors. And in order to handle all this, you need a stable economy to support your active foreign policy if it is to be sustainable. And there, as you say, we Sweden and we the US and we Europe generally, of course, have big and increasing and rather ominous economic problems, but that's nothing compared to what Turkey is seeing. Partly because of ideological and otherwise grounded shortcomings on the part of the regime in Ankara, because they have tended to have a Islamic ideological view on rates and how to view on those. So that's part of the story. But Turkey has today, and I just come from a GMF conference in Istanbul, where this was discussed. So what is the kind and degree of gravity of Turkey's economic problems as they look now? And I have to say that there was almost scary things said from experts at that conference about, for example, how do you deal with political stability in the context of an inflation, which in the case of Turkey is 75% and rising. 75%. We are having 7% and are suffering. They have 75%, meaning and even higher in the powerhouse Istanbul, for example, meaning that for regular people they have to adjust negatively to worsening conditions for their daily lives. I mean, the food, the price of food, the price of gas, the price of housing, all those things. So it's simply incredible how and as a result of these structural problems, the lira, the currency, has lost value from in 2018 it was 3-1 or so against the dollar. Now it's 17.5 to 1 against the dollar, meaning that all those, whether corporates or individuals that have borrowed money abroad for their investments and having to rotate those. I saw the figure of more than $180 billion in debts that have to be rotated on this slippery slope of losing value. And the exchange, the capital exchange rate, not rates, but the exchange between Turkish and foreign economies getting more and more burden. And then you have, and you did have the pandemic that added to the problematic. Of course, now it is more or less over for the time being. Thank God for that. But you have added problems related to the Ukraine crisis, and some say that the possibilities for the central bank to help infuse money into the economy so that the growth figures can continue to grow. And economic growth seems to be so important for the government that they tend to omit other factors. But it's a sinking ship, and something drastic needs to be done. And there is only one drastic thing which would be sufficient to tackle this, because Turkey has bigger economic problems of all than all other emerging markets, including Argentina nowadays. So something drastic needs to be done, but those drastic things need perhaps to be using the power of the IMF. The IMF are setting conditions that are unacceptable. So IMF no-go in Turkey, said the experts in Istanbul last week. And can you do something, using the techniques of IMF, but still not formally applying for assistance from IMF? No, you cannot, because then you don't have the added economic sources that a standby agreement with IMF would provide. So the question is, what kind of secrets are there if the overall resources from the central bank, for example, here, which is nowadays, by the way, completely politicized. So Turkey facing elections sooner or later, sooner meaning November, later meaning June. They are really suffering from what can possibly be done politically in order to deal with what is objectively needed economically. So this is one important aspect. And of course, there is no interest on the part of any major Western country to see the Turkish economy collapse, because there are so many vested interests from European banks and other institutions into the economy of Turkey. Investors hesitate, of course, into adding money to the Turkish economy under conditions of lacking rule of law, as we have seen. But there is no interest to see the Turkish economy collapse completely. But there are big uncertainties now as to how the polity will react to the economy now that Turkey is facing elections. So it will be exciting to see how they deal with that. But I have an ominous feeling of, if not disaster, then big problems in this area.
I hope that we can say now that we're getting to the comparative advantage of this podcast. Because against this background, when we have zoomed out on these three important variables, security, prosperity, and freedom, we come to the question of the time perspectives in the context of the ongoing negotiations. We know that there are many negotiations going on between Turkey and its Western partners. We are, of course, in Sweden, particularly interested in the Nato issue, and there are different views and I have the feeling, strong feeling, that many people have different views about the time perspectives in this negotiation on the Nato issue, because they have not zoomed out, or they have zoomed out. There is a difference here. Some who look at the bigger perspective said they tend to calm the debate, saying, listen, there is a bigger picture out here. This is not the only issue is not what Sweden does on the issue of Kurds. There is a much wider picture. There are many other negotiations going on between Turkey and its Western partners, where Turkey is a demandeur, not the Western states. And one has to see earlier Turkish ways to negotiate in critical situations, like the migration crisis during 2015 and so on, how they systematically use situations where they believe they have something to gain in a negotiation. But one should not, in such situations, over-dramatize what it means that you lose a month or several months or maybe more than several months in a particular negotiation. For instance, Carl Bildt again stresses that the very most important thing is that Sweden has now taken a position on the NATO issue. It has shown its interest. It has received an overwhelming positive reaction from the United States, UK, Germany, and other important countries in the EU, in NATO. In reality, Sweden has already created, together with Finland, the perception that there is strong support for Swedish security and Finnish security in the Western countries, and that is the most important thing.
And a high value attached to the contributions that Swedish and Finnish.
And one has a strong feeling, and many people are seeing much more clearly now that Swedish and Finnish NATO membership in the particular situation we are now, not least after the 24th of April, is in the interest of NATO. But of course, there is a worry, not least we heard it demonstrated on the Finnish side, that they're worried that there might be, the process might stall if we are not getting a definite progress by the Madrid summit of NATO taking place at the end of June. But in order to get zoom out on this particular issue of the Turkish negotiating perspective, what is it which is at stake for them? My question as a non-expert, because you have been Swedish ambassador to Turkey, you have followed Turkey for a very, very long time now, and you were ambassador already in the 90s. So you have a long time perspective. Many people who follow this on the Swedish news and perhaps also in other countries like the United States may see it as a question, a bilateral issue between Sweden and Turkey. Not so much Finland and Turkey, but mainly Sweden and Turkey. But is this really a relevant description of the negotiating situation? Isn't there a much wider perspective?
My view concurs to a large extent with what you referred to. You quoted Carl Bildt saying, and there are many others that have followed Turkey in a long time. I have this same general position that, of course, and also Lars-Erik, I have been ambassador to Turkey rather long time ago. I know that the question of the Kurds and the PKK and all those things, they were on the agenda at that time also. I was constantly called to the foreign ministry complaining about PKK circles having something called Med TV, broadcasting from Swedish territory or Danish, they were shifting. This was late 90s, so I'm so used to this. And more or less I felt that the various Turkish government and the various Swedish governments have agreed to disagree on this. There is a difference. They know that we have a large grouping of immigrants in Sweden. We have had our open policy, our internationalist outlook, etc., meaning that we are perceived by many as a place, as a haven for dissent, especially against authoritarian regimes. So, I mean, for me, this is a flow of normal that I see a lot of déjà vu from it. Nothing special, but we learn to live with the differences and to agree to disagree. That's fine. And on top of this, Sweden has, and so has Finland, been seen to. I saw an article on this morning that you sent me about being, both Finland and Sweden being adding voices to those that have stressed the strategic necessity for Europe to have Turkey adapt to EU standards, so that thereby could become a member of the European Union. Anything less than that is not completely satisfactory from a security and transatlantic and EU-Russia point of view. So you have big issues there. What I'm trying to say is that you have this normal flow, and then now this sudden and for many surprising Turkish reaction to our memberships. I see this only as President Erdogan, I think surprisingly to his own foreign ministry, by the way, took this position because he saw an opportunity to react to other things, and he's quick to react when the opportunity arises. That's classical for a political leader like him. So the issues are much broader, and the question always arises that even if many are now saying we have to take Turkey's security concerns, the legitimate security concerns seriously. This is an appeal from the chief of NATO, for example, now that because he has to administer now this process in the pre-Madrid perspective. And then, of course, there are many questions that arise once you look into it. So what does it mean to take Turkey's legitimate security concerns seriously? And what are those security concerns? What does concern mean? By the way, is it a threat perception, or is it simply a thinking aloud concern? Well, if it's a threat, it's not the broader strategic threats. It's terror. The threat terror that they are really talking about. And then the questions arise as to, so what are those concrete terror threats where Turkish actions on those threats and against those threats have appeared to be excessive to their friends in the Western world. And now they are seizing the opportunity, using Finnish and Swedish and NATO vulnerability at this stage of enlargement. And it's such an important step of enlargement that for Biden and others, it's a must. And therefore, Turkey tends to shoot itself in the foot in the sense of becoming rather an isolated voice, where the cost of the isolation will arise over time. So I agree with you that on the question of who is in a hurry here, you have to distinguish between the pre-Madrid period and the longer period. I think on all this that one has to be not relaxed at all, but take a calm view that the longer line here will have to be concerned with the long-term strategic relationship with Erdogan's or post-Erdogan's Turkey, the big, mighty, rising regional big power in the sensitive area, and the whole Western collectivity, whether it be EU or NATO. In NATO, they have the veto power right now, but I see structural discussions necessarily and unavoidably occurring over the years to come. In the EU, as you know, we have this tendency to try to avoid the traps of consensus rules because this renders ineffective decision making. Maybe we'll have the same kind of discussion in NATO if it is possible at all. But I see that, as you also quoted, that the important thing on this is that Sweden and Finland have committed themselves now, even if the Finnish president has been saying the other day that had he known about this Turkish resistance, then he would or might not have applied at all. I look upon things differently. I think it was a necessary step on the part of both countries. And since we have committed, the period of interim between commitment and application and then final ratification and entering into force of the Article 5, it can be a process. It would probably have been lengthy anyway. So I think that one has to see how crucial was this Madrid opportunity really. But the next few weeks are interesting. I saw that Norway is going to decide tomorrow or something about accepting the entrance of Sweden and Finland, and if other NATO governments follow suit on this, in this the coming weeks ahead of the Madrid meeting. Then, of course, the isolation of the Turkish position will be strengthened. But you have to remember the situation in Turkey, as we talked about before. So I think we should expect that this the important steps have been taken. The degree of support rendered to our applications have been massive on the part of many. I heard in the conference in Istanbul about how valuable Germany looks upon this, for example. So the issues are much more bigger than being a sort of bilateral quarrel between over the PKK presence in Sweden and the arms embargo things. So we are part of the much bigger picture, as most people would say nowadays.
Yes, and to close the circle, so to say, from what you just said, my perception of what is at stake for Turkey is that it is both the power of Erdogan in the Turkish system, his power to stay, to his possibility to stay in power as a leader and president of Turkey, which is the freedom dimension, if you like. I mean, how to manage elections and the system, so to say. It is the economic situation. And then the third dimension, we now talked about the status of Erdogan as leader, we talked about the economic dimension, and the third dimension is security. There, my question is, after having listened to a podcast on nuclear weapons in Swedish radio this morning, where they started by saying that we have the nuclear weapons that the United States has stored in Turkey. Well, I don't know if that is true. Nobody really knows whether those weapons still are deployed there. And even more, one is there is obviously a discussion to what extent extended deterrence is in full force across the entire European NATO allied territory. And so this has to do with the question in the long-term picture, is NATO going to support Turkey in all respects with deterrence and defense for the future? That is a question that we don't have. I mean, the answers may be from time to time that there will be expressions of support from NATO, but it's certainly not a consistent and self-evident support for everything that Turkey might be up to in order to protect what it perceives to be its interests. So that's where I thought personally that the notion that terror is the only, so to say, concern that Turkey has is perhaps only part of the answer, since we see also in Russia that the concept of security has been broadened to include the survival of the leadership and the survival of the society in all dimensions.
Yeah, it's you touch upon many important things here. You're right, I think, in saying that we don't know if the Americans have withdrawn the B-61s from the Incirlik base. And the whole question of the Incirlik base, in addition to those weapons stored there under the nuclear sharing arrangement, had everything to do with the fight against ISIS and the use of the of Incirlik as the sortie point for the air war against ISIS at the time. Now that conflict is reduced to something much smaller. But on the other hand, you have the question of the Ukraine crisis and Turkey's clear ambition to maintain some kind of neutrality, hoping to provide a balancing act so that it also could be that this could be an investment in a future role as mediating country. And of course, for the West, it has been, for the US now, it has been important to address Turkey very politely on this score, And it was seen by many in the beginning of this year as a possible return for Turkish sort of credibility in NATO contexts, and it even led further to perhaps helping Turkey modernize its air force by providing upgraded F-16s, although they were expelled from the F-35 program. But it has, I mean, everything is connected here, and you're of course right in reviving the old question of to what extent Turkey needs NATO support and needs for what. For some time, the issue was rather something in between the broader strategic aspects and the terror-linked questions that are prevailing now. Now, you had the question of building defenses against a potential first Syrian and then Iranian missile threat, even which a bit far-fetched, perhaps North Korean one. That is to say, the missile defense system, which is also also has a radar installation in eastern Turkey, and as such an important component. But there has always been credibility problems with all discussions about what kind of protective role is NATO willing and able to provide Turkey with. It is quite clear now that NATO has no interest in committing itself to the defense of Turkey against its very localized enemies, sometimes provoked by Turkey itself. I mean, the question of supporting Turkish aggression in Syria, for example, is off table. But this is more or less what Turkey still asks for, at least active support, at least being freed from constant criticism and paria stamps, so to speak. So, yes, Lars-Erik, there is a mixed bag here, and one simply has to understand the relationship between the various threat levels of the overall security situation, combined also with domestic policies.
Good summary.